In 1874, Savannah, Georgia, there was a family where brides died on their wedding night. Not once, not twice, but again and again, like clockwork striking midnight. The Harper family estate became a monument to tragedy, where wedding bells turned to funeral tolls within hours. Margaret Harper, the eldest daughter, collapsed in her bridal chamber as the clock struck 12. Her white dress stained with blood. 2 weeks later, Clara Harper followed the same fate, convulsing during her wedding reception as lightning split the sky. Then came Lydia, the third sister, who didn't even make it through the ritual toast before death claimed her too. The townspeople whispered of an ancient curse, a supernatural force that stalked the Harper bloodline. But was it really the work of dark spirits, or something far more sinister? Daniel Whitaker, a war-scarred surveyor from Pennsylvania, arrived in Savannah just as the third funeral ended. He saw what others missed, the patterns that pointed not to ghostly vengeance, but to calculated murder disguised as fate. Eleanor Harper, the last surviving daughter, became the town's living ghost. Branded as cursed, shunned by merchants and feared by children who chanted "Bride of Death" when she passed. But Eleanor possessed something her sisters didn't: the determination to uncover the truth before she became the fourth victim. As Daniel dug deeper into the Harper family's secrets, he discovered marriage contracts with deadly clauses, hidden poisons, and a conspiracy that reached into the highest circles of Savannah society. The wedding preparations for Eleanor had already begun. The dress was fitted, the guests invited, and the poisoned cup prepared. But this time, the bride knew what was coming. The question remained: in a world where women were powerless and truth was buried with the dead, could Eleanor and Daniel expose the killers before the curse claimed its final victim? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Spring 1874 painted Savannah in delicate pastels, magnolias blooming white against the backdrop of antebellum mansions that still bore scars from the war. Gas lamps flickered along cobblestone streets as evening descended, casting dancing shadows that seemed to whisper secrets in the humid air. The Harper estate stood like a crown jewel among the grand homes, its wrought iron gates gleaming in the lamplight as carriages rolled through, carrying guests dressed in their finest silks and satin. Margaret Harper, eldest daughter of one of Savannah's most prominent families, walked down the candlelit aisle with practiced grace. Her wedding dress, imported from Paris at considerable expense, trailed behind her like spilled cream. The guests whispered approvingly about the Harper family's good fortune in securing such an advantageous match with the wealthy merchant family. Yet as midnight's bells began to toll across the city, something shifted in the air. A chill that made the candle flames dance nervously. The celebration had lasted deep into the night, filled with music, dancing, and toasts to the happy couple. But as the final guest departed and the newlyweds retired to the bridal chamber, Margaret's joyous laughter turned to screams that echoed through the mansion's halls. Her new husband's cries for help pierced the night as Margaret collapsed, her body convulsing violently before going still forever. The blood-stained wedding dress would become the first artifact of tragedy in what Savannah would soon whisper was a cursed family. Dawn broke, gray and oppressive over Savannah, the city buzzing with gossip that spread faster than yellow fever. In the marketplace, beneath Spanish moss that hung like funeral shrouds, vendors huddled together exchanging theories. Some insisted it was a sudden illness, perhaps her heart overwhelmed by wedding day excitement. Others, their voices dropping to fearful whispers, spoke of darker forces, curses that followed bloodlines like hunting hounds. Eleanor Harper, 19 and possessed of the same delicate beauty as her deceased sister, pressed her face against the upstairs window of the family estate. The shutters remained closed throughout the mansion, as if the Harper family sought to hide from the world's judging eyes. But Eleanor could hear every word the neighbors spoke as they gathered in the street below, their voices carrying on the humid morning air. She clutched her diary to her chest, its leather binding worn from years of secret thoughts and observations. Within its pages, she had recorded every detail of Margaret's final days, the way her sister had seemed nervous before the wedding, how she had whispered fears that Eleanor had dismissed as pre-wedding jitters. Now those dismissed concerns took on sinister significance. The breakfast table felt cavernous, with Margaret's empty chair serving as a stark reminder of loss. Eleanor's father, Mr. Harper, sat rigid and silent, his newspaper held high like a barrier against the world's speculation. The morning light filtering through the dining room windows seemed cold and unforgiving, illuminating the family's new reality. Eleanor stared at Margaret's place setting, untouched and waiting, knowing that her own life had irrevocably changed with those midnight screams. The steamboat Southern Belle churned through the muddy waters of the Savannah River, bringing with it a stranger whose arrival would prove more significant than anyone could imagine. Daniel Whitaker stood at the vessel's rail, his surveyor's map case slung across his shoulder, studying the city's skyline with the methodical eye of a man accustomed to measuring distances and calculating angles. The war had left its mark on him, not just in the slight limp that favored his left leg, but in the way his eyes seemed to search for hidden dangers in peaceful scenes. Pennsylvania seemed a lifetime behind him as he disembarked onto the humid embrace of Georgia. The surveying work that brought him south promised steady income and a chance to rebuild his life far from battlefields that still haunted his dreams. As he arranged for lodging at a modest inn near the river district, Daniel noticed the unusual number of mourners dressed in black, their faces bearing the particular gravity that accompanied unexpected death. His first glimpse of the Harper estate came as he walked the city's elegant squares, familiarizing himself with Savannah's layout. The mansion stood like a fortress of grief, its windows dark and forbidding. On a second-floor balcony, a young woman stood motionless as a statue, her pale dress making her appear almost ghost-like against the shadows. Even from a distance, Daniel could sense her isolation, the way she seemed separated from the world by invisible barriers. When he inquired about the somber mood at his inn, the proprietor's face darkened with a mixture of fear and fascination. "Another Harper bride," the man whispered, glancing around as if the very walls might be listening. "Dead on her wedding night, just like the stories say." Daniel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air, sensing that he had stumbled into a mystery that would demand his attention whether he sought it or not. 2 weeks passed like a fever dream, the Harper family's grief settling over them like a suffocating shroud. Against all wisdom and the whispered protests of Savannah society, Clara Harper's wedding proceeded as scheduled. The second daughter had always been the most spirited of the sisters, her laughter infectious and her determination unshakable. She insisted that Margaret's death was a tragic coincidence, that love would protect her from whatever fate had claimed her sister. The wedding guests arrived with a mixture of curiosity and dread, their festive attire contrasting sharply with their nervous expressions. The ceremony itself passed without incident, Clara radiant in her grandmother's antique lace, her groom beaming with what some observers noted seemed more like relief than joy. Thunder rumbled ominously in the distance as the evening reception began, storm clouds gathering like dark omens above the Harper estate. As the traditional bridal toast commenced, lightning split the sky with supernatural fury. Clara raised her glass with trembling hands, her earlier confidence replaced by a growing sense of foreboding. The crystal goblet seemed to catch the lightning's reflection, creating an almost ethereal glow around the young bride. But as the liquid touched her lips, her face contorted in sudden agony. The lightning-split locket found clutched in Clara's dead hand would later become another piece of evidence in the growing mystery. Her collapse during the ritual toast sent guests screaming into the stormy night, leaving Eleanor standing alone in the ballroom beside her sister's body. The pattern was becoming undeniable. 2 brides, 2 wedding nights, 2 unexplained deaths. Eleanor stared at Clara's still form, her mind racing with terrible certainties about her own future as thunder faded into an ominous silence. The morning market became a gauntlet of humiliation for Eleanor as she attempted to purchase basic supplies for the household. Merchants who had once competed for the Harper family's business now turned their backs or quoted impossibly high prices, their faces twisted with superstitious fear. Children who had played in the squares with Eleanor just months before now scattered at her approach, their mothers pulling them close with whispered warnings about the cursed girl. The preacher's condemnation came during Sunday service, his voice booming through the chapel as he spoke of divine judgment and unholy bloodlines. Eleanor sat in the Harper family pew, feeling the weight of hundreds of hostile stares as Reverend Collins declared that the Harper family had brought darkness to Savannah through their sins. The congregation nodded along with his words, their fear transformed into righteous anger by his inflammatory rhetoric. Walking home through the city squares, Eleanor endured the worst humiliation of all, a group of children following her with a cruel chant, "Bride of Death, Bride of Death, who will die beneath her breath?" Their young voices carried a viciousness that seemed impossible for their ages, yet their parents watched approvingly from doorways and windows, encouraging the taunting that drove Eleanor to tears. The torn shawl hanging from her shoulders became a symbol of the community's hatred, damaged during a confrontation with angry merchants who accused her of bringing evil to their city. By the time Eleanor reached the safety of the Harper estate's iron gates, she understood with crystal clarity that Savannah would never accept her existence. The townspeople had found their scapegoat, and she was marked for destruction as surely as her sisters had been. Fate arrived in the form of a scattered basket and Daniel Whitaker's gentlemanly instincts. Eleanor had ventured out at dusk to gather herbs from the small garden she maintained near the estate's service entrance, hoping to avoid the crowds that made her daytime appearances so torturous. The basket, filled with carefully selected plants that revealed her unexpected knowledge of natural remedies, tumbled from her hands when the latch on the garden gate caught her dress. Daniel, returning from a surveying expedition along the river, witnessed the accident and immediately moved to assist. His hands worked efficiently to gather the scattered herbs. Lavender for calming nerves, valerian for sleep, and several others that hinted at more serious medicinal purposes. Eleanor watched him with wary eyes, unaccustomed to kindness from strangers in her current circumstances. Their exchange was brief but charged with significance. Daniel's northern accent marked him as an outsider, someone untainted by Savannah's growing hysteria about the Harper curse. His respectful manner and genuine concern touched something in Eleanor that had been frozen by weeks of hatred and suspicion. When he handed her the restored basket, their fingers brushed for just a moment, a connection that felt electric in its simplicity. Eleanor turned back toward the estate, her heart racing with unfamiliar hope. Through the iron bars of the gate, she glanced over her shoulder to find Daniel still watching her with an expression of protective concern. For the first time since Margaret's death, Eleanor allowed herself to believe that she might not be entirely alone in facing whatever darkness had invaded her family. The scattered herbs, now carefully restored to her basket, seemed to carry the promise that some things broken could indeed be mended. Lydia Harper's wedding was planned with desperate determination, the family's attempt to salvage their honor from the wreckage of superstition and fear. The youngest sister besides Eleanor, Lydia had always been the most fragile of the Harper daughters, prone to nervous fits and easily overwhelmed by social pressure. Yet she agreed to the marriage arrangement with touching bravery, insisting that her love for her intended would protect her from the fate that had claimed Margaret and Clara. The guest list had dwindled significantly, many of Savannah's elite finding convenient excuses to avoid what they privately termed the death wedding. Those who did attend arrived with the morbid fascination of spectators at a public execution, their eyes scanning constantly for signs of supernatural intervention. The ceremony proceeded with agonizing tension, every creak of the floorboards and flicker of the candles interpreted as omens. Daniel, driven by curiosity about the Harper family's tragedies, positioned himself among the sparse crowd of observers. His surveyor's training had taught him to notice details others missed, and he watched the proceedings with analytical attention to patterns and inconsistencies. The ritual toast approached with the inevitability of a tolling bell, the assembled guests holding their collective breath. Lydia's collapse came before she could even complete the traditional blessing over the wine. Her convulsions were more violent than those of her sisters, her young body fighting desperately against whatever poison coursed through her veins. Across the chaos of screaming guests and overturned furniture, Daniel's eyes met Eleanor's in a moment of shared understanding. The pattern was complete, undeniable, and Eleanor now stood as the sole surviving daughter, the last bride waiting for death's claim. The morning after Lydia's funeral, Eleanor woke to a world that had fundamentally shifted around her. The newspaper headlines screamed of curses and divine retribution, the Harper family estate now openly referred to as a house of death. The isolation that followed was complete and suffocating. Servants whispered and crossed themselves when she passed. Delivery men refused to approach the mansion, and even the family's longtime physician declined to continue his services. Eleanor's nights became battlegrounds against terror and despair. She paced the empty halls of the mansion, haunted by echoes of her sister's laughter that seemed to drift from every shadowed corner. The family portraits that had once brought comfort now appeared to watch her with accusing eyes, as if even her ancestors blamed her for surviving when her sisters had not. Sleep brought nightmares where wedding veils transformed into burial shrouds and altar bells rang funeral knells. Daniel found himself increasingly drawn to the Harper estate during his evening walks, his analytical mind rejecting the supernatural explanations that satisfied the rest of Savannah. His experiences during the war had taught him that human cruelty often masqueraded as divine judgment, and the pattern of deaths seemed too convenient to be the work of otherworldly forces. The coincidences were too precise, the timing too calculated. Standing outside the estate's gates in the gathering dusk, Daniel made a decision that would change everything. Whether Eleanor wanted his involvement or not, he would uncover the truth behind the Harper family tragedies. The town's petition demanding Eleanor's exile had begun circulating that very day, and time was running short for justice to prevail over superstition and fear. Daniel's investigation began with the one man in Savannah who had examined all 3 Harper brides after their deaths. Dr. Edmund Corley, the city's chief physician, received his visitor in a study lined with medical texts and specimens that spoke of scientific rather than supernatural explanations for human mortality. The elderly doctor's hands shook slightly as he poured brandy for them both, the weight of his knowledge evident in his troubled expression. "Off the record, Mr. Whitaker," Dr. Corley said after ensuring his office door was securely closed. "The symptoms I observed in all 3 young women were consistent with acute poisoning rather than any natural illness. The convulsions, the foaming at the mouth, the rapid onset, these are hallmarks of certain toxic substances, not divine curses or family maladies." Meanwhile, Eleanor's desperate search through her father's private study had yielded disturbing discoveries. Hidden behind false backs in filing drawers, she found marriage contracts unlike any she had ever seen. These documents contained clauses that seemed to bind not just dowries and properties, but lives themselves. The legal language was complex, but the implications were terrifying. Each groom stood to inherit significant wealth upon their bride's death, provided it occurred within specific time frames. The sound of approaching footsteps sent Eleanor into a panic as she hastily concealed the incriminating documents. Her father's study had always been forbidden territory, and being discovered there could prove fatal if her growing suspicions were correct. With her heart pounding like a trapped bird, she slipped the most damaging contract into the hidden pocket of her dress just as the door handle began to turn. Dr. Corley's revelation and Eleanor's discovery represented pieces of the same horrifying puzzle. The Harper brides were not victims of supernatural forces, but of calculated human greed, disguised as fate. The Harper mansion after midnight became a labyrinth of shadows and secrets, each creak of the ancient floorboards echoing through halls that had witnessed 3 decades of family history. Eleanor moved through the darkness like a specter herself, driven by desperate need to understand the forces that had destroyed her sisters. The locked trunk in the burned-out room had haunted her dreams since childhood, a mysterious container that had survived the fire that claimed the East Wing years before Margaret's birth. Using a hairpin she had bent into a makeshift key, Eleanor worked at the ancient lock with trembling fingers. The trunk's contents revealed a history more sinister than she had dared imagine. Newspaper clippings about previous accidents involving young women connected to the Harper family business interests, insurance policies that paid out suspiciously large sums, and correspondence that suggested the family's wealth had been built on a foundation of carefully orchestrated tragedy. From his position outside the estate, Daniel watched the solitary light flickering in Eleanor's window, wondering what revelations drove her to such late-night explorations. His own investigation had led him to the docks, where conversations with ship captains and cargo workers painted a picture of the Harper family's business practices that contradicted their public reputation for honor and integrity. The family fortune, it seemed, had been sustained through methods that honest merchants would never employ. Eleanor's father appeared in the doorway of the burned room like a malevolent spirit, his tall frame blocking her escape route. "Eleanor," he said with deceptive calm, "you should not be wandering the house at such hours. Young ladies require their rest, especially those with important duties ahead of them." His hand fell on her shoulder with the weight of a chain, and Eleanor understood that her midnight investigation had placed her in mortal danger. The trunk's contents, hastily concealed beneath her nightgown, felt like burning evidence against her skin as her father escorted her back to her room with the courtesy of a jailer. Eleanor's next venture into Savannah's marketplace became a gauntlet of hatred that exceeded even her worst expectations. The torn shawl that now marked her as the cursed daughter drew attention from every corner, turning ordinary citizens into a hostile mob. Merchants spat at her feet, children threw stones, and respectable ladies pulled their skirts aside as if her very presence could contaminate their virtue. The confrontation escalated when Mrs. Pemberton, a prominent society matron, accused Eleanor publicly of being in league with dark forces. "You bring death wherever you go," the woman shrieked, her voice carrying across the square. "First your sisters, now you corrupt our city with your evil presence." The crowd's approval of these accusations emboldened others to voice similar condemnations, creating a chorus of hatred that surrounded Eleanor like a closing trap. Daniel appeared at the crucial moment, his northern accent cutting through the southern drawl of accusation like a blade. "This young woman has done nothing but endure tragedy with remarkable dignity," he declared, positioning himself between Eleanor and her tormentors. His military bearing and obvious physical strength gave the crowd pause, but their superstitious fear ran deeper than their respect for his courage. "You don't understand, stranger," called out a merchant who had refused Eleanor's business. "That girl is marked by death itself. Every man who comes near her family dies or disappears. You'd best keep your distance if you value your life." The warning carried the weight of genuine belief, transforming the marketplace into a tribunal where Eleanor stood condemned without trial. Walking back toward the Harper estate together, Eleanor and Daniel shared their first honest conversation about the dangers surrounding her. "They will never let me live in peace," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of their footsteps on cobblestone. Her torn shawl fluttered in the breeze like a battle flag, marking her as both victim and survivor in a war she had never chosen to fight. Daniel's analytical mind had been trained by years of surveying to recognize patterns in landscape and structure, and the Harper family documents revealed patterns just as clear as any topographical map. The marriage contracts Eleanor had risked everything to obtain showed systematic financial manipulation that spanned decades. Each groom had arrived at their engagement deeply in debt, only to see their financial obligations mysteriously resolved within weeks of the wedding announcement. The bank records Daniel obtained through carefully cultivated contacts painted an even more sinister picture. The Harper family's wealth fluctuated in direct correlation with their daughters' marriages, large sums flowing out during engagement periods and flowing back in through insurance settlements and inheritance claims after the inevitable deaths. The timing was too precise to be coincidental, the amounts too substantial to be ignored. Eleanor's own investigation had uncovered a pattern in her father's daily routine that chilled her to the bone. Every evening at precisely 9 o'clock, he met with Mr. Colton, the family steward, in his private study. Their conversations, conducted in voices too low to overhear, always preceded significant developments in the family's marriage arrangements. The correlation between these meetings and subsequent tragedies was becoming impossible to ignore. Most disturbing of all was Eleanor's realization that her father had been studying her own habits and preferences, noting her daily routines with the same methodical attention he had once paid to her sisters. His questions about her health, her favorite foods, and her evening activities had seemed like paternal concern at the time, but now revealed themselves as the calculated preparations of a predator studying his next victim. The pattern was complete and horrifying. The Harper family curse was nothing more than an elaborate murder scheme designed to enrich the family coffers through the systematic elimination of inconvenient heirs. Eleanor now faced the terrifying certainty that she was next on the list, and her father was already making arrangements for her final wedding. The confrontation Eleanor had been dreading finally arrived over dinner in the family's formal dining room, where portraits of long-dead Harper ancestors gazed down from gilt frames like silent judges. Her father's announcement that he had arranged her engagement to a wealthy widower from Charleston was delivered with the same casual tone he might use to discuss the weather, but Eleanor's response shattered the pretense of normalcy that had protected them both. "I know what you did to Margaret, Clara, and Lydia," she said, her voice steady despite the terror that gripped her heart. The words hung in the air between them like an accusation written in fire, impossible to retract or ignore. Her father's reaction was even more chilling than she had anticipated. No surprise, no denial, just a cold calculation that confirmed her worst fears. "My dear Eleanor," he replied with deadly calm, "you have always been too imaginative for your own good. Young ladies who allow their fancies to run wild often find themselves in situations they cannot escape." His hand moved to the bell that would summon the servants, and Eleanor understood that she had just signed her own death warrant by revealing her knowledge. The secret ledger she had discovered contained coded entries that now made perfect sense. Payments to unknown parties, arrangements for special wines to be delivered for wedding celebrations, and correspondence with contacts in other cities who specialized in what the codes referred to as permanent solutions to temporary problems. Her father was not just a murderer, but the head of a conspiracy that reached far beyond Savannah. Eleanor fled from the dining room before her father could summon help, her heart racing as she realized that her investigation had transformed her from an unknowing victim into a dangerous witness. Racing through the mansion's dark corridors toward the garden where she prayed Daniel might be waiting, she knew that her only chance for survival lay in exposing the truth before her father could silence her forever. The poisoning attempt came disguised as a family dinner with visiting cousins, a gathering designed to create witnesses to Eleanor's apparent good health before her arranged marriage. Eleanor noticed the bitter taste in her wine immediately, the same metallic flavor that the maid who had suffered from Clara's leftover toast had described before collapsing in the kitchen. Years of studying her sister's deaths had prepared her for this moment, and she discreetly set aside the poison glass while maintaining the appearance of normal consumption. The maid's testimony, given from her sickbed to Daniel during a clandestine interview, provided crucial evidence of the murder method. "The wine tasted wrong," she whispered, her face still pale from her brush with death. "Like copper pennies mixed with flowers it was. I only had a sip from Miss Clara's glass while cleaning, but it near killed me. Someone's been putting death in those wedding cups, mark my words." Eleanor's careful observation of the dinner service revealed how the poison was administered. Mr. Colton, the family steward, personally selected and prepared the wine for special occasions, ensuring that only the intended victims received the contaminated beverages. His access to every room in the mansion, granted by his massive key ring, made him the perfect accomplice for her father's murderous schemes. The realization that she had just survived an assassination attempt filled Eleanor with a mixture of terror and determination. Her father's cold smile across the dinner table told her that he knew exactly what had transpired, and that this was merely the first of many attempts he would make on her life. The game had moved beyond investigation and into outright warfare, with Eleanor's survival depending on her ability to outwit killers who had already claimed 3 victims. That night, as Eleanor pretended to suffer from a mild stomach ailment that would explain her survival of the poisoning, she began planning her counterattack. The evidence was mounting, the patterns were clear, but she needed irrefutable proof that would convince Savannah's citizens that the Harper curse was nothing more than human greed disguised as supernatural vengeance. Daniel's attack came without warning as he returned from the docks after gathering more evidence about the Harper family's business dealings. 3 masked men emerged from the shadows of a narrow alley, their faces hidden but their intent unmistakably violent. They moved with the efficiency of professional killers, not common thieves, and their weapons were chosen for intimidation rather than robbery. "Northern stranger," the leader hissed as his companions held Daniel against the brick wall. You've been asking too many questions about things that don't concern you. Savannah has ways of dealing with outsiders who can't mind their own business. The beating that followed was methodical and precise, designed to send a message rather than to kill, though Daniel understood that next time he might not be so fortunate. The warning note they left with his battered body was written in an educated hand, its language sophisticated despite its threatening content. The Harper ghosts rest uneasy when disturbed by those who should know better. Leave Savannah while you still can, or join the spirits you seek to defend. The message confirmed that the conspiracy reached beyond the Harper household and into Savannah's broader community. Bloodied but determined, Daniel made his way to the Harper estate to warn Eleanor of the escalating danger. His appearance at her window, bruised, torn, and bearing evidence of violence, crystallized her understanding that they were no longer investigating a historical mystery, but fighting for their lives against active killers who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. Eleanor's discovery of Mr. Colton's nighttime activities provided the final piece of the puzzle they needed. The steward's massive keyring granted him access to every room in the mansion, explaining how the bride's private chambers could be infiltrated for poison placement. His frequent conferences with her father, which she had observed from hidden positions throughout the house, revealed the planning that went into each carefully orchestrated murder. The conspiracy was larger and more dangerous than either of them had imagined, reaching into multiple levels of Savannah society and protected by violence that made their investigation a death sentence if discovered. Eleanor's forced engagement to the Charleston widower was announced with great fanfare, her father presenting it as the family's redemption from the tragic deaths that had plagued their bloodline. The man himself was unremarkable, middle-aged, recently bereaved, and suspiciously eager to marry into a family marked by supernatural tragedy. His willingness to overlook the Harper curse spoke to financial desperation that made him the perfect pawn in her father's final game. The engagement ring that marked Eleanor as the next intended victim was an ornate monstrosity that felt like a shackle around her finger. Its weight served as a constant reminder that her days were numbered, that the same forces that had claimed her sisters were now closing in around her with methodical precision. Yet rather than surrender to despair, Eleanor began planning the counterattack that would either save her life or ensure that her death would expose the truth. Daniel's evidence portfolio had grown into a comprehensive case that documented every aspect of the conspiracy. Financial records, witness testimony, physical evidence, and correspondence that painted a clear picture of systematic murder for profit. The challenge lay not in proving the Harper family's guilt, but in finding a way to present the evidence before Eleanor became the next victim of her father's greed. The wedding date was set for the following month, giving Eleanor precious little time to execute her plan. Her father's confidence in his scheme's success was evident in his relaxed demeanor and increased attention to business matters, as if the resolution of the Eleanor problem would allow him to focus on more profitable enterprises. His mistake lay in underestimating his daughter's intelligence and determination. Eleanor's secret meetings with Daniel, conducted in shadowed corners of the estate garden, took on the urgency of military planning sessions. They had one chance to expose the conspiracy and survive the attempt, and failure would mean not only Eleanor's death, but the continuation of a murder scheme that might claim future victims as well. The wedding preparations began with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized the previous 3 Harper family tragedies. Eleanor's dress was fitted with expert precision, the menu was planned with elaborate care, and the guest list was compiled with diplomatic consideration for Savannah society's complex web of alliances and enmities. To outside observers, it appeared that the Harper family was determined to overcome their recent misfortunes with a celebration worthy of their former social standing. Eleanor's cooperation with these arrangements masked a desperate internal struggle between terror and determination. Her father's satisfied expressions during wedding planning sessions told her that he considered her defeat a foregone conclusion, that she would follow her sisters into death with the same helpless inevitability that had characterized their fates. His mistake was assuming that knowledge of the trap would paralyze rather than empower his intended victim. The forced engagement ring had become Eleanor's secret weapon, its ostentatious design concealing a hidden compartment where she stored small amounts of evidence too dangerous to keep elsewhere. Each night she added to her hidden collection fragments of correspondence, small samples of suspicious substances, and copies of documents that would prove her father's guilt if she could survive long enough to present them. Daniel's preparation took a different form, focusing on timing and positioning that would allow him to present their evidence at the moment of maximum impact. His surveyor's training in observation and measurement would prove crucial in the choreographed revelation they planned, where precision could mean the difference between justice and another successful murder disguised as supernatural vengeance. The town's anticipation for the wedding carried undertones of morbid fascination, with betting pools established on whether Eleanor would survive her wedding night or follow her sisters into the family crypt. The Harper estate had become Savannah's most notorious attraction, drawing visitors who hoped to witness either a miraculous breaking of the curse or its final, tragic fulfillment. The wedding ceremony proceeded with all the pageantry expected of a Harper family celebration, despite the reduced guest list and the palpable tension that hung over the proceedings like morning mist. Eleanor moved through the rituals with practiced grace, her composure masking the intricate plans she and Daniel had developed to turn the evening's finale into an exposure of truth rather than another mysterious death. The moment of the traditional bridal toast arrived with the weight of destiny, the assembled guests holding their collective breath as Eleanor raised the crystal goblet that had served as an instrument of death for 3 of her sisters. The wine within gleamed like liquid amber in the candlelight, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Every eye in the ballroom focused on Eleanor's face, watching for the first signs of the curse's manifestation. In a movement so subtle that only the most observant witnesses noticed, Eleanor managed to switch her poisoned glass with the one held by Mr. Colton, who stood nearby in his role as the ceremony's master of arrangements. The exchange was accomplished through a carefully choreographed accident involving her wedding dress train in an apparently clumsy stumble that brought her into contact with the steward. Colton drank deeply from what he believed was his safe glass, his face reflecting complete confidence in the evening's planned outcome. Within moments, his expression shifted from satisfaction to confusion, then to the unmistakable agony that had characterized the Harper bride's final moments. As he convulsed and collapsed before the horrified wedding guests, Eleanor's voice rang out clear and strong. "Behold the true face of the Harper family curse." The ballroom erupted in chaos as Colton's poisoned form writhed on the marble floor, his death throes serving as undeniable proof that the Harper curse was nothing more than calculated murder. Eleanor's accusation cut through the screaming and confusion like a blade, her voice carrying the authority of absolute truth, as she pointed directly at her father's shocked face. Daniel emerged from his position among the guests, his evidence portfolio in hand, and began laying out the documents that proved the conspiracy's scope and duration: bank records, insurance policies, correspondence with the grooms, and witness testimony spread across the nearest table like a prosecutor's case, each piece of evidence building an unassailable wall of proof against the Harper patriarch. "Ladies and gentlemen of Savannah," Daniel announced, his voice trained by military service to carry across battlefields, "you have witnessed the final act of a conspiracy that has murdered 4 people and deceived an entire city. The Harper family curse was nothing more than poison administered by trusted servants, designed to enrich the family coffers through systematic elimination of inconvenient heirs." Eleanor's father, cornered by evidence and witnesses, attempted one final denial, but his own documents betrayed him with merciless precision. The guest list included several of Savannah's most prominent citizens, their presence ensuring that the truth would spread throughout the city faster than any previous rumors about supernatural vengeance. The social network that had once protected the Harper family's reputation now worked against them with devastating efficiency. Mr. Harper's desperate attempts to maintain his innocence collapsed under the weight of physical evidence and eyewitness testimony, his carefully constructed facade crumbling like a house built on sand. The crowd's transformation from wedding guests to an outraged mob happened with frightening speed, their shock and horror at the evening's revelations converting instantly into demands for immediate justice. Hands that had moments before raised champagne glasses in toast now reached for Mr. Harper with violent intent, their voices joining in a chorus of condemnation that echoed through the ballroom like thunder. Mr. Harper's attempts to flee were thwarted by guests who had positioned themselves between him and every exit, their unified determination to see justice served, overriding any consideration for due process or legal procedure. The chains they found in the estate's carriage house were intended for securing luggage, but they served equally well for restraining a murderer who had escaped accountability for far too long. Eleanor collapsed into Daniel's arms, the enormous strain of maintaining her composure throughout the evening finally overwhelming her exhausted system. The mixture of relief, grief, and vindication that flooded through her was almost too much to bear, her body shaking with sobs that had been suppressed for months of careful planning and desperate fear. The dragging of Mr. Harper from his own ballroom marked the end of the Harper family's social prominence, and the beginning of Eleanor's freedom from the shadow of death that had haunted her existence. The estate that had once represented power and prestige now stood as a monument to the consequences of greed and the ultimate triumph of truth over deception. Savannah's collective realization that they had been deceived by supernatural explanations for human evil would reshape the city's relationship with gossip and superstition, though the lessons learned would prove difficult to maintain when faced with future mysteries that challenged rational explanation. The Harper mansion's emptiness echoed with the ghosts of happier times as Eleanor walked through rooms that had once rung with her sister's laughter and conversation. The servants had been dismissed, the furniture covered with sheets, and the family portraits taken down to prevent their accusatory gazes from haunting the halls where so much tragedy had unfolded. Each step Eleanor took through the abandoned estate felt like a goodbye to the girl she had been before, learning the truth about her family's dark legacy. Daniel waited patiently in the garden while Eleanor completed her final tour of the mansion, understanding that she needed this time to process the magnitude of what they had uncovered and the price that justice had demanded. His own wounds from the alley attack were healing, but the psychological scars of their investigation would take much longer to fade. The violence they had faced and the corruption they had exposed had changed them both in ways that would require time and healing to fully understand. Eleanor's visit to her sister's shared bedroom proved the most difficult, the space still carrying traces of their personalities despite the removal of personal belongings. Margaret's music sheets remained on the piano, Clara's embroidery hoop sat by the window, and Lydia's collection of pressed flowers decorated the dresser top. The room felt like a shrine to innocence destroyed, a reminder of lives cut short by greed disguised as fate. The final candle that Eleanor extinguished in the mansion represented more than just the end of her residence there. It symbolized the death of the Harper family's public legacy and the beginning of her own independent existence. As darkness settled over the estate, Eleanor understood that she was leaving behind not just a house, but an entire identity that had been shaped by lies and maintained through murder. The river cottage that became Eleanor and Daniel's new home was modest in every way that the Harper mansion had been grand, but its simplicity offered a peace that no amount of luxury could provide. Located several miles upstream from Savannah's bustling commercial district, the property offered solitude and the healing power of natural beauty, unmarked by human tragedy or corruption. Eleanor's first garden in her new life consisted of practical vegetables and healing herbs rather than the ornamental flowers that had decorated the Harper estate. Her hands, once soft from a life of privilege, grew calloused from honest work that connected her to the earth and the cycle of growth and renewal that promised hope for the future. Each plant she tended represented a small victory over the death and destruction that had defined her past. The cottage deed bore both their names, a legal arrangement that represented their partnership in building a life based on truth and mutual respect, rather than contracts designed to benefit others. The simple document carried more weight and meaning than any of the elaborate marriage arrangements her father had crafted, representing choice freely made rather than obligations imposed by circumstances beyond their control. Daniel's surveying work provided steady income while allowing him to travel throughout the region, mapping territories that were rebuilding after the war's devastation. His profession, focused on accurate measurement and honest assessment of land value, seemed perfectly suited to a man who had learned to distinguish truth from deception in the most dangerous circumstances. Their evening conversations by the cottage's fireplace centered on plans for the future rather than analysis of past tragedies, marking Eleanor's transition from victim to survivor, and finally to a woman in control of her own destiny. Love came to Eleanor and Daniel with the quiet inevitability of sunrise, built on shared danger overcome and mutual respect earned through trials that had tested both their courage and their character. Their confession of feelings took place during an evening walk along the river, where the sound of flowing water provided a soundtrack for promises that neither of them had expected to live long enough to make. Eleanor's admission that she had never thought she would survive to experience genuine affection revealed the depth of trauma she had endured during her family's reign of terror. The simple act of imagining a future filled with joy rather than fear represented a psychological breakthrough that spoke to her remarkable resilience and capacity for healing, despite everything she had suffered. Daniel's declaration of love was accompanied by his promise that their relationship would be built on partnership rather than protection, recognizing Eleanor's strength and intelligence rather than treating her as a fragile victim in need of rescue. His respect for her capabilities and his willingness to share both decision-making and responsibilities marked their relationship as fundamentally different from the patriarchal arrangements that had characterized her sister's doomed marriages. The simple wedding band that would eventually mark their union stood in stark contrast to the elaborate forced engagement ring that had symbolized Eleanor's impending doom. Its plain gold surface carried no hidden compartments for evidence, no ostentatious display of wealth, and no contractual obligations beyond the mutual promises of two people choosing to share their lives freely. Their promises to each other were made without contracts, dowries, or family obligations, representing a new kind of relationship based on trust and affection rather than financial arrangements designed to benefit others at their expense. Years passed before Eleanor felt ready to share the full truth of the Harper family curse with the children who had blessed her marriage to Daniel. The story she told around their fireplace was carefully crafted to convey the importance of critical thinking and the dangers of accepting supernatural explanations for events that might have perfectly rational causes, rooted in human nature and motivation. The family Bible that served as Eleanor's teaching tool contained not just religious verses, but detailed records of the Harper family's true history, names, dates, and circumstances that would preserve the truth for future generations who might otherwise fall victim to similar deceptions. Her careful documentation ensured that the lessons learned through such terrible cost would not be forgotten by those who came after. Eleanor's children listened with the wide-eyed attention that only the young can bring to stories of mystery and adventure, but their mother was careful to emphasize the human elements of the tale rather than the supernatural aspects that had so captivated Savannah society. Her goal was to raise children who would think critically about claims of otherworldly intervention while remaining compassionate toward victims of deception and manipulation. The final entry Eleanor made in the family Bible concerned the lingering question that had haunted her since that terrible wedding night when justice was finally served. Was the Harper curse truly nothing more than human greed and calculated murder? Or had some supernatural force guided events toward the revelation of truth and the punishment of the guilty? The answer, she wrote, was less important than the lesson that truth and courage could overcome even the most elaborate deceptions. As her children fell asleep by the dying fire, Eleanor's gaze turned toward the window, where moonlight reflected off the river that had carried them all toward freedom and redemption.